Welcome to Baha'i Books and Authors, a podcast which introduces to you writers and the works they've penned related to the Baha'i faith. We'll explore the inspiration, the process, and the stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jan Grammer. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media, which also produces Baha'i audiobooks. His is a name with which we're familiar among those early believers in the West, though we may not have known much about him until now. John David Bosch in the Vanguard of Heroes, Martyrs, and Saints by Angelina Diliberto Allen is a book that gently unfolds the story of a man who found the Baha'i faith when he was well into middle age and found a calling. He was quiet, humble, reserved, though staunch in faith and unstoppable in his service to his faith. He was a close and longtime friend, really a brother, of the first American Baha'i. His is a life of spiritual conviction that found expression in efforts toward the building of the Mother Temple of the West, in donating land that became important to many people's lives down the generations, moving to another country to serve, and most profoundly, in his devotion to and connection with Abdu'l-Bahá. He was one of the 6 Western believers in the Holy Land at the time of the Master's passing in 1921. We spoke with the author about that historic, important time, which she wrote about, When the Moon Set Over Haifa, in the first episode of this podcast series. Her book on John Bosch offers more than a biography. It's an exploration of how one early believer's faith was lived through his service, and how dedication can have an impact in lasting ways. Whether you're discovering John Bosch for the first time, or returning to a familiar and admired figure, this story offers both insight and inspiration. We welcome back Angelina Diliberto Allen. I'm very happy to say hello to you again, Angie.
Thank you for having me.
Please tell us about John Bosch before he encountered the Baha'i faith. Who was he?
John Bosch was born in St. Gallen, Switzerland in 1855, but immigrated to the United States when he was in his early 20s, lived in Nebraska for about 10 years with his sister, and then came to California in 1901. In 1903, he was the administrator of the wine industry in the Geyserville region. He was on a train back from San Francisco to Cloverdale. He met a woman on the train who was holding a book written about Abdu'l-Bahá, and he asked about the book. The book was called Abbas Effendi. John later wrote about that encounter and said that Mrs. Beckwith told him what a privilege it is to know about the teachings of Baha'u'llah given by Abdu'l-Bahá in this book. And then she said, it is better not to know about it if you can't follow these teachings. And of course, that's what interested him the most was, well, this is something that's special and I want to understand what it is.
He was in his late 40s when he heard of the faith and embraced it quickly. His friendship with Thornton Chase was forged soon and very deeply. Why do you think this is so?
They met in 1909 at the National Baha'i Convention. Thornton Chase was named by Abdu'l-Bahá as the first believer in the United States. I think that what's so unique about Thornton Chase is his profound understanding of the dangers of personality. When we think about firmness in the covenant of Baha'u'llah, it's this attachment to our understanding that this is God's universe, not anyone's personal kingdom. Thornton Chase was very careful to warn the early believers against this tendency that Americans have to worship personalities. I think that John Bosch was really drawn to that. There's a quotation from the Bab that reads, "Become as true brethren in the one and indivisible religion of God, so that ye may find yourselves reflected in them and they in you. This is the true path of God." I think that John Bosch sensed that attraction to the divine in Thornton Chase and John Bosch, this love of God that they both had.
Please tell us about his special relationship with Abdu'l-Bahá.
That relationship began, I think, first when John Bosch declared his faith. Those were the days when anyone declaring their faith wrote directly to Abdu'l-Bahá. John writes just a beautiful letter asking to be a member of this universal religion. And then, of course, when John Bosch learned that Abdu'l-Bahá was coming to America in 1912, he was determined to meet him. Abdu'l-Bahá had no plans to come to California, so John Bosch went to the East Coast, traveled there, and met Abdu'l-Bahá in New York. That encounter in the book is given directly by John Bosch because John Bosch wrote so many notes about his experiences. So much of the book is firsthand from the words of John Bosch and his experiences. Abdu'l-Bahá loved John Bosch for his transparent sincerity.
Were there any interactions that John Bosch had with the master that surprised you?
When a person learns of this faith about the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, the oneness of humanity, you want to tell everyone, but you want to do that with a special regard for the readiness of your hearer. There's this passage, I'll read it, where Abdu'l-Bahá is in his hotel room and John Bosch is there. And John Bosch writes, "I said to Abdu'l-Bahá, I regret very much that I have not the capacity as a teacher, and by nature am rather reserved in talking." Abdu'l-Bahá, he says, looked directly at me, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You are doing well. You are doing better than talking. It is not always the elaborate talking that would accomplish results. It is the heart that is powerful. With you, it is not words. Your heart talks."
We can't have a conversation about John Bosch without talking about his wife, a devoted and very active Baha'i in her own right, Louise Stafford Bosch. Tell us about their marriage and their life together in service.
In the book, I put a timeline that John Bosch wrote himself. The timeline gives a snapshot of how he understood his life development up until the moment he met Louise. It's 5 dates. 1903, I read a book called Abbas Effendi. 1909, in my 6th year, in other words, my 6th year of being a Baha'i, I attended convention. In 1910, in my 7th year, Mr. Chase. 1912, in my 9th year, Abdu'l-Bahá in New York, Washington, Chicago, and San Francisco. 1913, in my 10th year, Louise came to my rescue. In addition to this timeline, we have a record of their correspondence together. They corresponded before they met. In one of the letters, she writes to John Bosch saying she feels that she has already spoken to him and he to her. So I really think that they had this spiritual understanding of each other before they had a physical understanding of one another. And I think it makes their relationship so special. And it makes me think of this letter, this recent letter from the House of Justice that they wrote in 2025 on the family. And even though John and Louise didn't have children, their whole life was family. It was the Baha'i family. And in this letter, the House of Justice says, such a family, and I'm suggesting that John and Louise had such a family, can demonstrate a way of life that can be emulated by all those who seek to counteract the divisive forces that feed discontent, conflict, and self-interest, and to weave the bonds of trust, cooperation, and constructive action upon which a healthy community depends. And John and Louise built that healthy community.
They picked up and went pioneering to Tahiti when Louise was 50 and John was 65. Though they were there only 5 months, it was impactful. Can you tell us in what ways?
There were people who arose as a response to the Tablets of the Divine Plan, which came out in 1916. John and Louise were one of the first to arise. Of course, the other most famous person to arise in response to the Tablets of the Divine Plan is Martha Root, and then also the Duns who went to Australia. And thinking about what's significant about their 5 months there, I cannot overstress the importance of the work that anyone does in community development and the humility that goes with that work. All of us engaged in the betterment of society are interested in. In 2005, it was the first time we learned this phrase, a humble posture of learning. It's the first time that we became familiar with that phrase of the House of Justice, and it became part of our lexicon. I think a reader reading this chapter on Tahiti would receive very important instruction on what it means to take and assume a humble posture of learning, because they learn about community development They get all the skills that they take with them later when they come back to the United States and continue to serve the community.
A number of people, though, in Tahiti became interested in the faith, didn't they?
Yes. When I wrote this chapter, I really thought it would read a little bit like a soap opera because the stories are so real, so human, with human failing, with human victory, with all the highs and lows of what it means to strive in this world. And we learn about Rene Gass and Alexander Drolet, their own path toward spirituality and taking on their understanding of these teachings and applying it to their lives, which for every person is a different adventure.
The Bosches donated their land later in Northern California for a Baha'i school. It wasn't just a matter of giving their property. They were intimately involved in establishing the Geyserville Baha'i Summer School. How did that unfold?
In 1926, the National Spiritual Assembly decided to hold the National Baha'i Convention in San Francisco. The purpose was to expand and integrate the East and the West of the United States. And at that convention, Louis Gregory, who is one of the best known believers in the history of the United States, he is an African American and a hand of the cause of God. He was asked to give a speech at that convention. Louis Gregory said, "Among the different races and groups and classes of people in the world, the ideal of today is cooperation, mutuality, service. If one wants to distinguish himself, let him become distinguished in service to humanity. Let him stand upon this principle of the oneness of God and the oneness of the entire human race. Whoever stands upon this exalted principle will never be shaken by the shifting sands of time. Whoever stands upon this exalted principle, like the lever of Archimedes, will move the world." So this phrase, to move the world, is an understanding that the teachings of Baha'u'llah are the lever to combat all of the forces that are the negative forces in the world. And we can move the world toward unity with these teachings. John Bosch is thinking, how can I create an environment in which people can learn this? And so he set about to open his property as a school where people can learn about the oneness of humanity. The first session, the entire session was devoted to the oneness of humanity. The summer before that summer when it opened in 1927 is another very important convention in which Sadie Oglesby, a Black believer who had just returned from the Holy Land, gave a very important address about the importance of race unity. These two talks, I think, became the fundamental impetus of John Bosch's efforts at Bosch Baha'i School. And I think it's so important for us to remember that as John's legacy.
The subtitle of your book is In the Vanguard of Heroes, Martyrs, and Saints. Please elaborate on that.
It comes from a quotation which is from a letter written on behalf of The Guardian. I came upon this quotation because I had had a conversation with a former member of the House of Justice, Hooper Dunbar, about my ideas about writing this book. And he said to me, of all the writings of our faith, there are only a few people referred to as saints. Of course, the Holy Family are saintly, Martha Root is saintly. And then he said, there are three other people who are specifically characterized as saints: William Sutherland Maxwell, Roy Wilhelm, and John Bosch. And I thought, oh, well. So then I further researched on that, and there's a wonderful quotation from The Guardian that reads, "There are two kinds of Baha'is, one might say. Those whose religion is Baha'i, and those who live for the faith. Needless to say, if we can belong to the latter category, if we can be in the vanguard of heroes, martyrs, and saints, it is more praiseworthy in the sight of God."
John Bosch was friends with many of the early Baha'is, in addition to Thornton Chase. Helen Goodall, instrumental in teaching him the faith. Amelia Collins, Roy Wilhelm, Leroy Iowas, Keith Ransom Keller, and Horace Holly, just to name a few. Let's talk about Amelia Collins. How did they know one another?
You know, the people you've named, of course, are the heroes, martyrs, and saints. And I think a person reading this book will learn so much about others. And we learn about John Bosch through his relationship with these other people. Amelia Collins is one of them. And she preferred the name Millie, but would joke about her name, Amelia, with her stationery that said Amelia Earhart. Millie Collins was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly in 1924 and onward. And so she was directly involved in the establishment of the Geyserville Bahá'í School as a member of the National Spiritual Assembly. We know that later she was named a Hand of the Cause of God. Even later than that, went on to serve the Guardian in person in the Holy Land. But the thing that's so special about her is that she was a woman of personal wealth, but did not live ostentatiously herself, and had this approach to her wealth that it didn't matter that her name was associated with anything that her wealth contributed to. It was more important that the work got done. But her contributions are tremendous. In fact, the Guardian called her the great benefactress of the faith. She donated to the building of Western Pilgrim House, the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab, the International Archives building, the embellishments around the Shrine of Baha'u'llah in Baji, the entire purchase of the land of the future temple site on Mount Carmel, endowments for houses of worship in Europe, Australia, and Africa, and she built the meeting hall at Geyserville Bahá'í School. So I think she's just as proud of that building as she is of all of her other contributions.
Let's talk about the Guardian, Shoghi Effendi. The Guardian characterized John's attitude towards service as unostentatiously rendered. What was John's relationship with him?
It's so interesting to me to think about Shoghi Effendi as a person who understood both Eastern and Western culture so deeply, and yet he never visited Persia and he never visited the United States. But he understood us, and he understood us from the people he met. So as a child, he met all of those early believers that are mentioned in this book. When they went on pilgrimage, he would have been a child watching and observing them and learning from them. Then when he became the Guardian, this is now in November 1921, he is now Guardian, arrives in the Holy Land and meets John Bosch, and John Bosch meets him for the first time. The Guardian already understood American believers, and he understood the failings of Western culture and saw none of these failings in John Bosch. In fact, there's this letter that was written on behalf of the Guardian and after the passing of John Bosch, and it was written to Louise. It says, "No doubt when the cause spreads more throughout Switzerland, this fatherland of his will grow to be proud of this heroic and noble soul it produced, even though the best days of his life were spent in America."
What do you hope readers of your book will carry with them long after they've finished?
A biography is a study in looking back at a person's life and at all of the things they achieved. All of us, we know, are born noble, and all of us have the capacity to achieve a degree of nobility. John Bosch had greatness thrust upon him, especially given this privilege of being present during the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. And then what he did with that greatness was so unostentatiously rendered. It's such an instruction in his deep nobility.
John Bosch leaves us with the example of a life inspired and faithfully lived. Thank you so much, Angie, for a delightful and inspiring conversation.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
John David Bosch, In the Vanguard of Heroes, Martyrs, and Saints by Angelina Diliberto Allen, is available on Bahá'íBookstore.com in the section below where the book is listed. You can also listen to this podcast wherever you get your distribution services. Subscribe or follow Bahá'í Books and Authors with your chosen podcast platform.